All right, everybody, it is Steve with Real Progress in Action. Folks, we have watched over the last, I don't know, 5 years, watching people talk about Medicare for all. We watched Bernie Sanders bring it up in his first run for the White House. We watched him campaign on it in the second run for the White House. We have seen Joe Biden say he is not in any way, shape, or form passing Medicare for all. And you've got Nancy Pelosi, who is saying she's not even going to bring a vote. Then you've got the squad who's saying ultimately that they're not going to force the vote. And then you've got people protecting them that diminish their power even further by saying, oh, well, they would have never won the vote to begin with. Well, here's the problem. The federal government is the only one that can actually provide real, honest to God, single payer coverage for every person in the United States so that some people aren't left behind and others get it, so that everyone gets it. The only place where it's truly Medicare for all is paid for by the federal government. And this is a really big deal. Do you know why? Because, see, Medicare for all streamlines the process big time. It literally eliminates tons of these jobs that were out there just to deny you coverage. I mean, we're talking about bazillions of dollars traded back and forth in the effort to keep you from having coverage. So Medicare for all, at the national level, mind you, is the only place where a government option, if you will, government single payer option, where the federal government absorbs any cost hikes, any increases, any issues, they absorb those costs because they're the currency issuer. And it's the only place where across all 50 states and territories and the District of Columbia, where they can handle any bill that is payable in US dollars, period. Any one of them. So let's go the next step with this. Medicare for all, because it eliminates so much economic activity. Believe me, negative crap is still economic activity, and it still counts toward GDP. So when you eliminate that much economic activity, you streamline it, you save money. One person's spending is another person's income. That's the economy, folks. That's the way this game plays. That's the way it works. So when you trim away all that stuff, you got a lot of people that are going to be out of work, which we can rehome them back into supporting Medicare for all. Or we can find them other jobs that are actually helping people instead of serving to deny them coverage. That notwithstanding, the thing that is very important to understand is that no matter who is advancing the bill, whether it be the state-based programs funded by state taxpayer dollars, when states are at an all-time crisis with pensions and other just basic things like roadways and bridges at rated D infrastructure, and all the unfunded mandates that the federal government has placed on every state, and watching the race to the bottom, meaning that states like Texas and Kansas have made a career. They have made it their business to slash all taxes and to lure businesses down to their state, while simultaneously leaving islands of places where there's no work because businesses have left. There's no revenue, so they have no chance of ever improving or ever doing better. People are trapped in these deserts, these economic deserts throughout our country. And it's all because of the state's competitiveness at pulling business away. And anytime taxes go up in the state level, at the state level, folks, let's be very clear what we're talking about. We're talking about at the state level. People can pick up, and do, by the way, This is called capital flight, and it's called white flight. And you've seen it throughout. People of means want to get out. And this has been happening forever. For the last 40 years, we have watched it happen. And as people leave one school district, they abandon the tax base, and that school goes underfunded or unfunded. All the things in that local community go unfunded. Sure, they can raise taxes, but then those groups, they end up saying, you know what, screw you, we're leaving too. And that's how you ended up with Detroit. That's how you ended up with Buffalo. That's how you ended up with old school Pittsburgh. That's how you ended up with a lot of the Rust Belt. And that, my friends, is one of the most important things that we as a nation have to resolve, is taking away these burdens from the states, putting them where they belong on the federal government, so that states can operate fluidly without competing with one another for businesses. Sam Brownback literally cut the bottom out of all of the social services in Kansas. Schools were using books that were falling apart. School buildings couldn't even open. Everything was run down. He's a terrible person, a Republican no less. But what he did was exactly what Rick Perry did over there in Texas. And he bragged about it. Folks, these Texas governors brag about luring businesses down south. They brag about it. And they leave everyone up top hurting. And then their answer to that is, oh, well, should have done better. We're competing with you. We're going to do it. And they do it. So with that in mind, if we were to get a national-based Medicare for all type bill through, I told you it eliminates lots and lots and lots of economic activity. Good economic activity we don't want around. So it's a good thing, right? But it's got something called a deflationary bias. Number one, it takes a lot of people and takes them and gets them out of their jobs. So you better have something for them to transition to. But it also literally slows down the economic activity as a whole. And years ago, I spoke with Warren Mosler about this. And Warren was kind enough to give me the 411 on this. And a lot of people have shared this video around now for a very long time. But I'm going to go ahead and let you hear this right now. This is Warren Mosler talking about not only Bernie Sanders, but Medicare for all.
Now, the other thing I want to say about Medicare for all, which we tried to get through to Bernie Sanders, but without success, obviously, is I see it as a highly deflationary event. So right now I see, I'll just use very, very round numbers, but $3 trillion spent on healthcare. Out of that, $1 trillion in the private sector is private sector administration. That's pretty much going to go away if we go Medicare for all. But what does that mean if that spending goes away? Well, all those were all salaries going to, people who were like digging one hole and filling in another, which is what private sector, compared with, well, let's just say they were doing all the administration work. I'm not saying what they were doing wasn't valuable in its context, but the context had no value. But anyway, you had $1 trillion worth of wages and salaries going to people doing administration that aren't going to be there anymore. That's a highly deflationary event. All those people are going to be out of work in the unemployment lines looking for jobs. You don't raise taxes in that context. That makes no sense at all. You'd want to lower taxes or increase public spending somewhere else in that context. Now, yes, there will be other people spending more money to make up for it. Corporations will have lower healthcare costs, so they may be spending more on something else. People may be getting higher salaries. People will be, have lower healthcare costs. There won't be any healthcare premiums if it's Medicare for all, very little. Maybe you get a little bit of Part B or something. But and so there will be some inflationary biases, but I think the deflationary bias, at least initially, will dominate. So there's absolutely no reason to pay for Medicare for all with a tax increase like the Sanders campaign was putting out there. And it was a horrible tax. It was a regressive, punishing tax, even though it was supposedly on higher incomes. And the whole thing was, would have been led to, I think, 15 or 20% unemployment. I was like just categorically against that, raising taxes into a. Now that I'm thinking back on the taxes, they attempted it to be progressive, so I give them credit for that. But it would have wound up increasing unemployment, which is always a regressive phenomenon, dramatically. And it didn't have to be. And think of how much stronger the campaign would have been explaining it. Look, this is a deflationary event. You don't raise taxes for that. You don't pay for it that way. Okay. And you say, well, what about the deficit? You say, look, the public debt are the dollars spent by government that haven't yet been used to pay taxes. They sit in the accounts at the Fed called Treasury securities. What's the problem? While in the year 2030, the CBO reports the deficit's going to be $77 trillion in 20 years. They say, look, if the only problem a deficit spending can cause is inflation. So what you do is you look to the long-term inflation forecast, and they'll tell you if you have a deficit problem. Well, the long-term inflation forecasts are the CBO says 2%, the Fed says 2%, and your precious free market Treasury index bonds say something less than 2%. Okay, and I don't think 2% is an inflation problem. So what they're telling us is that even with today's budgets, even without making any adjustments at all, we're not going to have an inflation problem, which means somehow, so look, the burden of proof, if you think there's a deficit problem, the burden of proof is on you to show me there's an inflation problem. And so the burden of proof is on you to show me that the Fed, the CBO, and the free market is wrong with their inflation forecast. And if you can do that, fine, then I'll listen to you and take a look at whether or not we have a deficit problem. Okay, but he couldn't do that either. And so those were the two answers to any possible question on the public debt. It's just the dollars spent that haven't been used to pay taxes. It sits in accounts. What's the problem? And if there's, if there's no long-term deficit problem, even though the headline left, like Krugman and Reich, all these guys concede there's a headline deficit problem, they're wrong. The burden of proof is on them to show me that there's a long-term inflation problem, which means the Fed, the CBO.
All right. So with that, you can clearly see the economics tells us that we've got to do something other than raise taxes to pay for Medicare for all. But at the federal level, what are we up against? Well, we're up against a do-nothing Congress. We're up against lobbyists. We're up against every single neoliberal stronghold and every one of the think tanks as well. So with that in mind, people want to try and do the states. States are currency users, similar to you and I. If we go broke, they go broke. If, for example, states had money to burn and they could just do whatever, Flint would be taken care of by now. Puerto Rico would have been taken care of by now. But instead, Puerto Rico was given off to some receivership and stripped of its assets by vulture capitalists. The same thing that happened in Detroit, Michigan, where these vultures stole the history and everything from the museums and other assets that Detroit had that were special and precious to their community. Why is that? Because they can't create dollars. They're just like you and I. They can go out and buy bonds. They can raise taxes. But that puts us back into the race to the bottom. And when all states aren't cutting taxes or all states aren't raising taxes, people start making different decisions. And it's very important that as we go forward, we not only elect representatives that aren't afraid to tell the truth. No more cowards. No more of these people that are afraid to say the United States government can spend and purchase anything available in its own currency. But think about how challenging it is to tell the average person that Medicare for all actually requires a tax cut because it's deflationary. I want you to think about this because as people try to roll these things out to the states, that's not Medicare for all. That's Medicare for some, or that's state-based for some. And just like there's a FEMA, because we know that when there's a disaster, it requires huge amounts of money, like a pandemic. And if in that framing something bad happens, you and I, we can't handle shocks to the economy. And states, they're not much better off. They can barely handle. In fact, states have overinflated housing costs just so that they can get the higher tax revenues. They have purposely baked in inflation into the valuation of homes just to raise taxes. They've done a host of things that are so bad that could hurt so many people, that create asset bubbles just in the name of trying to get some revenue. The state of Pennsylvania has opted to enter into arrangements with fracking companies to try to fund public services. Fracking. States have to do anything by hook or by crook to stay afloat. The feds, not so much. They just have to have the will. They just have to have the votes. They just have to have us put constant pressure on them by taking to the streets, by demanding better. But sitting there ignoring the economics of this all is just as bad as somebody who ignores the atrocities in Israel, just as bad as somebody who ignores the atrocities of the drug war, just as bad, because more people die from bad economics than all the wars we've been in combined. I can't prove that number, but I can prove it. I'm telling you right now, more people die. And people don't associate bad economics with a gun to the head, but they should, because austerity is murder. And when we don't talk in real terms, when we allow people to use neoliberal framing, we allow people to use neoclassical economists. We allow people to say, well, here's an economist. He says something I like, so I like him. I like this economist because they told me what I want to hear. That's not a truth teller. That's not due diligence. And that is most definitely not responsible. When you have an entire community of modern monetary theory economists and activists fighting tooth and nail to explain this, it's important to consider what they might have to say. But as of right now, we are nowhere near close to Medicare for all in any way, shape, or form. Joe Biden has said no. The establishment has said no. And most of the people, now that Biden's been elected, have gone back to sleep, as we all knew they would. They're back at brunch. They're otherwise enjoying getting ready to reopen the economy, getting ready to put us all back into the meat grinder. They're not fighting for Medicare for all. So it's up to us to get out there and make it happen. I'm Steve Grumbine with Real Progress in Action. Have a great night, everybody. I'm out.